Wednesday morning after the election, I think we heard a collective sigh. It wasn't a sigh of complete satisfaction, nor was it a sigh of disappointment. But with the midterm elections completed, at least we got to say, thank God that is over. Friends, I bring a challenging message today. The midterm election was not an ending. My hope is that now that that is out of our way, at least for a little bit, we can tend to an equally important, if not bigger, challenge. As a country, we're coming apart at the seams. We seem to be Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives, before we are Americans. I'm not one to wrap myself in the flag, but it frightens me that political identity seems to have completely surpassed national identity for most of us. If you've been around for long, you've heard me preach about the genocide and racism that are foundational issues of the United States. There's nothing perfect or even necessarily better about our country than a lot of others, but it's still our country. At the end of the day, we have to figure out how to live with our 329 million American neighbors. It's not an option. Our faith, any decent faith, calls us to seek to understand and to care for our neighbors who are different from us. And maintaining at least some level of trust and respect across political difference is necessary for a functional democracy. This morning's worship service is largely inspired by a fellow named David Evans that I had the pleasure of reading about. He's not a political leader or a minister, but he lives his faith in a steadfast manner that's really inspiring, a way that I think strengthens his own life and his neighborhood. David participates actively in 2 different faith communities in Los Angeles. He alternates one Sunday attending a predominantly white congregation in Westwood. This white gentleman in his 80s blends in seamlessly to the crowd. On alternate Sundays, though, he settles in with an African-American congregation. There, David is the only white guy in the room most of the time. About this second church community, it's the oldest Black Presbyterian church west of the Mississippi. David says, yes, it's a bit weary. Yes, there are fewer and fewer in the pews, but the way I've been accepted and loved, the things I've learned about people I didn't know very well before, about Black people, I wouldn't trade this experience for anything, he says. Now, what's remarkable about this story isn't that David visited or occasionally visits an African-American church. What's remarkable is that he's been an active member of that congregation since 1992. After the Rodney King police brutality situation and the LA uprising, several white churches reached out to Black churches to build bridges. That's how David first came in contact. His white congregation in Westwood reached out to this Black congregation in South LA. It started out well, but before he knew it, he and his wife were the only 2 white people still showing up. This newspaper article that I read about David also interviewed a sociologist. That sociologist says that when it comes to such efforts, the real difficulty is in sustained action. Often, the difficulty isn't getting people together. The difficulty is keeping them together. For years, David attended both services. The very punctual white worship service ended in plenty of time for him to get across town to the African American service. But age and traffic caught up with him, so now he alternates Sundays back and forth. Through the relationships he built over the years, he was able to personally learn about America from a different perspective. He said, "I grew acutely aware that many black people think this is a racist country, but white people don't feel that way, and I didn't either. I didn't see it until I heard their stories and felt their pain. People talk about a post-racial society. Well, for the most part, white people say that. Black people know better," he said. Again, what makes this remarkable isn't that he visited or even that he participated in a campaign over a year or so. He's been a part of that community for 26 years, singing in the choir, celebrating and mourning with them. It's his spiritual home. He says that about a year into participating with them at social hour one Sunday, one of the members looked him in the eye and said, "You're here. You're really here, aren't you? And you're not going to leave us." We learn invaluable lessons from relationships with people whose experience is different from our own. Learning by being with people is a different kind of learning from simply reading. Being with people who have a different experience is transformative. It sometimes makes me sad that Tapestry can't provide that opportunity more often. The place I notice our homogeneous political outlook the most often is in our ministers' seminar book discussions. Every month, we read a book that enriches our Unitarian Universalism. About half of them are fiction and half are nonfiction. The conversations are great, but I've noticed, especially when we read nonfiction books, that we don't have any real political diversity in the room. Even when we're reading books about transcending the chasm between right and left, we don't have the conversation partners to figure it out. I doubt that Tapestry will ever be a politically broad congregation. Some of our priorities and the way we talk about them will always appeal to more liberal-minded folks. In a way, that's okay because it's who we are. But I think it's always important to attempt to notice what voice is not being represented. Who's not in the room? What viewpoint is not in the conversation? We work to welcome more people of color and to better serve the LGBT community. That's a clear priority. As we cast that net, it's worth noticing who slips through the holes. The reading that we did earlier, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. I hadn't paid much attention to it for a long time. You know, if there's to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. It's like the Russian nesting dolls of peace. I think I dismissed this passage for so long because it seemed sort of cliche or gimmicky. But slowly, I've learned to appreciate it more because it's a serious challenge. It's a serious challenge to walk your talk. Slowly but surely, I've learned that about the real challenges of ministry. It's not the strange hours that one keeps or the pastoral care that one does. The real challenge is integrity. When on Sunday you make suggestions to 80 people about how they might better live their lives, you begin to watch yourself very closely the other 6 days of the week. As Gandhi put it, being the change you want to see in the world is a serious challenge. Now, the other reason that this nesting doll reading has grown on me is because I've seen a breakdown in this chain of peace. You can put a finger on it. You can say, look, right there, that's where it is. We're able to do the inner peace part fairly well. We're able to keep peace with a circle of friends that are somewhat similar, but somewhere in the middle, right around, if there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. Things get real bumpy. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not even saying I necessarily know how, but I'm thoroughly aware that it's the challenge set before us. If we want a more loving, more stable, more thoughtful country, one absolutely necessary ingredient is healthier relationships among neighbors. Not friends, but neighbors. This reading teaches us that no one is exempt from the work of improving our world. And the big picture is an accumulation of smaller relationships. If we don't manage to build relationships with our neighbors across political differences, we cannot expect political leaders to reach across the aisle. If we don't engage our neighbors with curiosity, then we shouldn't expect news media to deeply explore facts. The word that might come to mind for some of us is compromise. Compromise is great, but there's another phrase that I think might be more helpful. It came to me a little bit from the famous prayer from St. Francis. This week I've been thinking about seeking more to understand than to be understood. Now, compromise suggests meeting somewhere in the middle, letting go of your position, not being fully committed. But that's not really what I'm asking you to do. I'm suggesting that we seek more to understand than to be understood. And of course, there are limits to this call to get to know our neighbors. I've, on the internet, lately seen this quote a lot from Robert Jones Jr. He writes, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." There's a limit to the need to respond to our neighbors with love. That limit comes up when being with our neighbors eliminates room for loving ourselves. There are a lot of opportunities to build bridges, to build trusting relationships. Stepping out of a conversation to take care of ourselves is okay. once in a while. It's not running away. It's okay to pick and choose when and where you build a bridge. Sometimes the span to be crossed is just too big. Sometimes the foundations of our own heart are not stable enough to build a bridge upon. That's okay. Last year, I had to make some hard choices myself about partnerships and bridge building. After Blaise Bernstein was killed in Lake Forest, I stepped away from some partnerships. For those of you who don't know, Blaise Bernstein was a gay Jewish young man that was killed in Lake Forest in a pretty heinous hate crime. Now, the murderer and his family were active participants in a Catholic church in Newport Beach. Shortly after that murder, I met with the priest there to unravel some of this for myself. And the priest reconfirmed what I already knew, that the church teaches that same-sex relationships are inherently bad. They're against God, that it's better to experience loneliness than to seek a loving relationship with someone of the same sex. This is what they teach their children. In the same conversation of discussing the murder of Blaise, this is the message the priest offered to me. This is the priest that was the priest at the church where the murderer attended. For about a year, I needed to step back from partnerships with Catholic organizations, or any organization that didn't clearly commit to LGBT equality. A year later, my heart is still broken, but I'm beginning to see more possibility of working alongside Catholic organizations on issues that are so important. Issues of immigration justice and prison reform, issues that they're really leaders on. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Today's invitation to seek to understand our neighbors, to learn to love our neighbors, is in no way a requirement to deny our own humanity or our own right to exist. There are plenty of bridges to be built. Maybe that one isn't the right one or the right time. So far, we've been talking about politics and sociology. But James Luther Adams, a famous Universalist minister, believed that building relationships was our religious mission as well. Now, his faith and his career were shaped by the buildup of the Nazi regime in Germany and the aftermath of World War II here in the United States. From what he saw, he argued that associations, clubs, religious organizations, trade unions, these things brought people together in a deeply important way. This was especially true when they brought people together from different backgrounds and different opinions. James Luther Adams observed this growth of deep relationships in churches. And he clearly called this goodness that grows among us God. As a Universalist, though, even in the 1950s, he knew that the G word wouldn't settle well with everyone in our ranks. So he decided that simply calling it love would be equally appropriate and accurate. I trust that somewhere in Orange County, another community that's different from our own is sharing a similar message today. I trust that some of our neighbors are seeking to know us. Whether you call it God or love or something else, there's a clear project before us to build relationships with our neighbors, not our friends, not the people that you came here with this morning, but the person whose experience is different from your own. Amen.